The snow had been falling since midnight. It fell without wind, straight down, from a sky the color of old iron. By dawn, the whole world had gone quiet, the kind of quiet only deep snow can make. And Adeline Sterling stood at the frost-rimmed window of the boarding house in Hollow Pine, watching a white country she did not understand. She was 20 years old, though fear had aged her eyes past that. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins on the long road. Her good navy dress was wrinkled from 2 days of sleeping upright in a stagecoach. A small cameo brooch sat at her throat, the only thing of value she owned, inherited from a mother who had been dead 5 years. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white, because she was about to marry a man she had never met. Let me say that again, so you understand what kind of morning this was. A girl of 20, 2,000 miles from everything she had ever known, standing at a window in a frontier town she could not have found on a map a month ago, waiting to marry a stranger, and it was the safest she had felt in 3 years. That tells you everything about what she was running from. Her name had been Adeline Marie Sterling since birth. Boston, the only child of a schoolmaster and his wife. They had not been rich, but they had been warm. Her mother taught her to read and sew and carry herself with dignity, even when supper was thin. Her father taught her Latin and Greek, and taught her above all that a woman's mind was worth as much as any man's. Then the fever came. It took her mother when Addie was 15. It took her father 2 years later. And at 17, she was alone in the world. That was when Ambrose Calloway appeared. He had been a deacon in her father's parish, a wealthy man, an importer of fine goods with a tall house on the good side of the city. When he heard the schoolmaster's daughter had no one, he offered to become her legal guardian until she came of age at 21. Everyone called it providence, a blessing, a mercy. Addie called it that too, for about 6 months. Until the night he came home from a business trip, smelling of whiskey and something underneath the whiskey that she had no name for yet. He told her she owed him, for his roof, for his bread, for his generosity. He told her there were debts. Her father's debts, he said, debts she had never heard of, and the only way to settle them was for her to marry him the day she turned 21. When she pulled away, he caught her wrist. His grip was iron. It had left a bruise shaped like a man's fingers. She wore long sleeves for a week to hide it. He did not strike her that night. He did not have to. The threat was in every line of his body. She understood. She was not a ward. She was a thing he had purchased. And one day soon, he meant to collect. What followed was 3 years in a cage with no bars you could see. He did not lock her up at first. He was cleverer than that. He simply made the world small. He dismissed the housekeeper who had been kind to her. He hired a man named Royston Pike to drive her and to watch her and to report where she went. He controlled her money, her clothes, the hours she was allowed in the garden. When she defied him, he took her supper away. When she wept, he smiled. He was building something, patient, year by year. A woman so worn down that by 21 she would walk to her own wedding because she no longer believed there was anywhere else to walk. The week before her 21st birthday, he came to her room, sober this time. Which was worse? He told her the wedding was set. He told her she would sign papers transferring the last of her father's estate to him, including the little plot of ground where her parents were buried. Then he left her with those words hanging in the dark, like smoke that would not clear, and Addie understood that if she did not run that night, she would never run at all. So she ran. She took what she could carry in one small bag, a change of clothes, her mother's cameo, her father's worn Greek New Testament, and a handful of coins she had hidden in her hem over 2 years. A penny here, a penny there, stolen back from a man who had stolen everything else. She walked 5 miles through a sleeping city to the only door she could think of, the Sisters of Mercy, a gray stone convent at the edge of town that looked more like a fortress than a house of God. She pounded on that door until her knuckles bled. The woman who finally opened it was old, 70 if she was a day, steel gray hair, eyes that missed nothing, Mother Bernadette. She listened to Addie's whole story without one interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. And when Addie was finished shaking and hoarse, the old woman was quiet a long moment. Then she said one word, "Come." For 3 months, Addie lived in a narrow room with a wooden cross on the wall and a window that looked out on a garden where nothing grew in winter. She taught the convent children their letters. She tended the sick. She began very slowly to believe the walls might hold. Then Mother Bernadette came to her with a letter and changed the course of her life a second time. There was a man, the old woman said, out in the Colorado Territory, a rancher named Josiah Holt. Years back, he had hauled timber to the convent when the chapel burned, and he had refused payment beyond the cost of the wood. "It's for the work you do," he had told them. Mother Bernadette had never forgotten it. Now she was calling in that kindness. She had written to him. She had told him she had a young woman who needed mountain air for her health, a sister she had written with a sickness of the lungs the city was making worse. Would Mr. Holt have a place for her this winter? The reply had come back in 4 words. "Send her. I'll meet the Christmas stage." Addie stared at the letter, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "But I'm not sick," she said. "I'm not a sister. None of this is true." Mother Bernadette met her eyes and did not flinch. "It's a door," the old woman said. "Calloway has been making inquiries. He knows you are here. The law, unjust as it is, still calls him your guardian until you turn 21. I cannot keep you forever, but out there, in a territory his money cannot reach. Married to another man, you would be beyond him." "Married?" Addie's voice was barely a whisper. "To a stranger." "I would not send you to a cruel man. I am too old to have that on my soul." The old woman took her hand. "But I will not lie to you, child. It is not a position as a governess. It is marriage. In a place so remote, you will depend on his mercy for everything. He may be kind. He may not. I only know that 8 years ago he chose to be honest when it cost him money to be. That is more than I can say for most men." Addie closed her eyes. Every road was a gamble. Stay and be dragged to an altar by a man she knew was a monster, or go and gamble on a man she did not know at all. She chose the unknown, because at least the unknown had a door she was walking through herself. The journey west took a week. Boston to New York, New York to Chicago, Chicago to Denver. Each leg carried her deeper into a country that grew wilder by the mile. Cities thinned to farms, farms thinned to endless prairie, and the prairie ran up at last against mountains that scraped the belly of the sky. In the coach from Denver, there were 4 other passengers, an old prospector, a young married couple bound for a homestead, and a man who made Addie's skin crawl the moment he climbed aboard. He was lean, weathered, maybe 40, with pale eyes that never seemed to land anywhere and never seemed to miss anything. He carried a rifle the way other men carried a walking stick. He gave his name as Eli Marsh. When he looked at Addie, she felt measured, weighed, like a man pricing a horse he did not intend to pay for. The young wife, a kind woman named Mrs. Tate, noticed it too. She made a point of sitting between Addie and the man for the rest of the road. She asked Addie gentle questions. Where she was from, where she was bound. Addie kept her answers small. Going to meet family, hoping to help a household. Nothing that would invite a second question. But she heard the whispers. Late when the Tates thought she slept. Something about the man up the mountain. The widower Holt. Something about a wife who died in the snow 8 years back, and a thing that was never quite right about how. Addie pressed her forehead to the cold glass and pretended not to hear. The coach reached Hollow Pine on Christmas Eve. The town was barely a town. One street, a store, a church, a saloon, a boarding house. Snow over all of it. So clean and so deep, it looked like the world had been wiped down and started fresh. She spent that first night at the boarding house. And in the morning, she stood at the window, waiting, which is where this story found her. A knock came at the door behind her. She turned, And there he was. He filled the doorway, tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes from 20 years of hard labor and not one day in a gymnasium. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a face weathered into clean, hard lines by sun and wind, and something heavier than either. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were not cruel. She had spent 3 years learning to read a man's eyes for cruelty the way a sailor reads weather, and there was none in his. There was only a tiredness so deep it had its own gravity, the look of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had stopped expecting to set it down. "Miss Sterling." His voice was low, a little rough, like he did not use it much. "I'm Josiah Holt." "Mr. Holt." Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "Thank you for meeting me." He looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable. Something moved behind his eyes. She could not name it. "You're not sick," he said. It was not a question. Addie's breath caught. "No," she admitted. "I'm not." "And you're no sister?" "No." He nodded, slow, like a man confirming something he had already guessed on the long ride down. "Didn't think so. Mother Bernadette writes a careful letter, but careful letters are the kind that hide things." He set his hat in his hands, turned it once. "I'm not going to ask you here in front of a window what you're running from. That's your business, and you'll tell it or you won't. But I'll say this much, so we start clean. I don't hold with lies between people who've got to share a roof, so I'll give you none. And in return, I'll ask you, tell me none. That fair?" Addie stared at him, because in 3 years no one had offered her anything fair. "That's fair," she said. "Good." He stepped back, held the door. "Can you ride? It's 7 miles up the mountain and the trail's no place for a wagon in this snow. I've ridden twice in my life, both times as a child." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, but the ghost of where one used to live. "Then you'll learn today," he said. "I brought a gentle mare. Her name's Juno. She's got more patience than I do, which isn't saying much." There were 2 horses tied in the street, his, and a smaller bay with a kind eye. He helped Addie up into the saddle, his hands careful at her waist, no longer than they needed to be, and then gone. He arranged her bag behind the saddle himself, checked her stirrups, checked them again. "If you feel yourself slipping," he said, swinging up onto his own horse, "you call out. I'll catch you before you hit the ground. You have my word on it." And the strange thing, the thing Addie turned over and over in her mind as they rode out of town, was that she believed him. The ride up took 2 hours. The trail wound through pine so heavy with snow the world went black and white and silent. The air thinned until every breath burned. Her thighs ached. Her hands went numb inside her gloves. But she did not complain once. She fixed her eyes on his broad back, and she followed it up the mountain, like following a door deeper into a house she did not yet know the shape of. Halfway up, he slowed his horse to ride beside her. "You're doing better than I expected," he said. "You expected me to weep." "I expected most anybody to weep. It's a hard trail." "I've had harder ones," Addie said, and then wished she hadn't, because his eyes came to her quick and sharp, and there was a question in them he had just promised not to ask. He didn't ask it. "All right," was all he said, and rode on. When the cabin finally came into view, Addie's breath caught for a wholly different reason. It sat in a clearing ringed by towering pines, built of dark logs that looked like they had grown up out of the mountain rather than been hauled to it. Smoke rose from a stone chimney in a thin, straight line. Snow lay deep on the pitched roof. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass. It was beautiful, in a stark, unforgiving way. The kind of beautiful that does not care whether you survive it. He helped her down, steadied her when her cold legs nearly buckled, and for one moment his hand stayed at her waist, holding her up, and she looked up into that tired face, and he looked down into hers, and neither of them said anything at all. Then he let go, and stepped back, careful, as if he'd remembered something. "Welcome," he said, and then quieter, like the word cost him, "Come in, out of the cold." Inside the cabin was one large room and two small ones off the back. A great stone fireplace took up most of one wall, a fire crackling in its mouth. Rough floors, woven rugs gone soft with age, a table by the window, a shelf of books with cracked spines, more books than she'd expected, a kitchen corner with a cast-iron stove. And then she saw it. Above the doorway to the left-hand room, carved into the wood of the beam, a name, Rebecca. Addie went still. Josiah followed her gaze, and something passed over his face like a cloud over a field. There. Gone. His voice when it came was flat and careful, the voice of a man stepping around a hole in the floor he'd stepped around 10,000 times. "That was my wife's room," he said. "She's been gone 8 years. I cleaned it out for you. Aired the bedding. You'll be comfortable enough in there. It's the warmest room in the house, next to the chimney." How did she die? The question came out before Addie could stop it. She heard how it landed, saw his jaw tighten. "In the snow," he said. "One winter morning. She went out for firewood and she didn't come back." "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "You should rest," he said, cutting her off, not unkindly, but like a door closing. "It's a long road from Boston. There's water in the pitcher, extra blankets in the chest. We'll talk in the morning about what happens next. Tonight, you just sleep." He carried her bag to the door of the little room, set it down, and did not go inside. She noticed that. He would not cross that threshold. That night, Addie lay in Rebecca's bed under Rebecca's quilt in a room that still held the ghost of another woman in every corner. A sewing basket sat in the corner, its lid pale with dust. Glass jars of dried herbs lined a shelf, their contents long past any use. Everything in this room had belonged to a dead woman, and now for 3 months at least, it belonged to her. She could hear him in the main room, the scrape of a chair, the slow tread of a big man trying to walk quietly, the settling of the fire, and then late the sound of a harmonica, a tune so lonesome it made her chest ache. He played it low, like a man saying something he could not say in words, to someone who was no longer there to hear it. She pressed her hand to the cold window glass and watched the snow come down, and she thought, "I have traded one cage for I do not know what." Morning came gray and clear. Addie woke to the smell of coffee and frying meat. For one heartbeat, she did not know where she was. Then it all came back. The mountain, the cabin, the name above the door. She dressed and found him at the stove. He'd been up for hours by the look of the wood already split and stacked by the hearth. He set a plate in front of her without a word. More food than she usually ate in a day. Eggs, bacon, thick bread toasted on the stovetop. "Eat," he said. "You're too thin. City living." She ate, and he sat across from her with his coffee, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the silence was not unkind. Finally, he set down his cup. "I'm going to talk plain now," he said, "because that's the only way I know how, and because you deserve to know where you stand. Mother Bernadette wrote me asking shelter for a sick woman. I knew it wasn't the whole truth before you stepped off that coach. A man doesn't get to my age without learning the shape of a thing left unsaid." He turned the cup in his hands. "So here's the truth from my side, and you can do with it what you want. I'm a lonely man, Miss Sterling. I've lived 8 years on this mountain with nobody but my own ghosts for company. When that letter came asking, would I take in a woman who needed a place to disappear, I thought, maybe we could be of use to each other." Use. Addie's voice went careful. She knew that word. She had heard it from another man's mouth. "Not the way you're bracing for," Josiah said, and he must have seen her flinch because his voice gentled. "I see I've touched something. I'm sorry for it. Let me say it cleaner." He met her eyes. "I'm offering you a marriage in name, so the law and that man you're running from can't reach you here. You'd have your own room, that one with the warm wall. You'd keep house if you wanted or not, it's no requirement. And I would never, not once, Lay a hand on you that you didn't ask me to lay. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Addie's mouth had gone dry. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do that? Take a stranger into your home and ask for nothing." He was quiet a moment. "Because somebody once needed shelter, and I had it to give," he said finally. "And because this house has been a tomb for 8 years, and I am bone-tired of living in a tomb. That's the whole of it. No prettier than that." Then he stood, crossed to a shelf, came back with a small leather pouch, and set it on the table between them. The coins inside clinked. "And so you know I mean it," he said. "There's enough in there for passage anywhere in this country and money to live on while you find your feet. I'll give you 3 months. You stay the winter, you see how the land lies, and come spring, if you want to go, you take that pouch and you go. No argument, no debt. The door opens both ways. It will always open both ways. That's the one promise I'll ask you to believe." Addie stared at the pouch, and something happened in her chest that she did not have a name for, something that felt alarmingly like it might turn into tears. Because for 3 years, a man had used money to build a cage around her, coin by coin, door by door. And here was a stranger, a hard-faced widower on a frozen mountain, pushing money across a table in the other direction to buy her a way out, to make sure the door stayed open. She had forgotten. She had genuinely forgotten that a thing could be given without a hook hidden inside it. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "You don't have to understand me," Josiah said. "You just have to choose. Stay or go. Either way, you're safe under this roof tonight. That much is settled." She thought of Ambrose Calloway, the whiskey breath, the iron grip, the wedding he'd set without asking her one single time what she wanted. She thought of the long road and the door she'd walked through herself. "I'll stay," Addie said. "The 3 months. I'll stay." Something eased in his shoulders, just barely, as if a weight he was used to had shifted half an inch. "All right," he said. "Then we'll see the preacher when the pass clears and make it legal enough to keep the wolves off. Until then, you rest and you eat and you let that mountain air put some color back in you." He picked up his hat. "I'll be out with the stock. You need anything, you holler. I'll hear you." He was at the door when she spoke again. She hadn't meant to. It just came out. "Mr. Holt, the woman in town said. They said there was something not right about how your wife died." He stopped, his hand on the latch, his back to her. For a long moment he didn't move at all. "Town talks," he said, low. "Town's been talking 8 years. Let it." And then, almost too quiet to hear, "I buried her on the hill under the aspens. I tell myself it was the cold that took her. The cold and her own stubborn heart going out in weather I told her not to go out in." A pause. "I tell myself that every single morning." And the way he said it, like a man reciting a prayer he had stopped believing, sent a cold finger straight down Addie's spine. Because that was not the voice of a man who believed it was the cold. That was the voice of a man who suspected something else and had not let himself look at it. For 8 long years. He went out. The door closed behind him, and Addie sat alone in the quiet cabin with a fire crackling and a name carved above a doorway. And she looked at the little room that had belonged to a dead woman, and she thought about the dust on that sewing basket in the corner, the one thing in the room nobody had touched in 8 years. She did not know yet what she would find in it. She only knew sitting there in the gray morning light that she had not escaped a story. She had walked into the middle of one. The pass closed 2 days after she said yes. Snow came down for a week without stopping, and the mountain shut its door behind them. No coach, no mail, no way down and no way up, just the cabin, the clearing, the pines bent under white, and 2 people learning slowly how to live in the same small space without frightening each other. It was not what Addie had braced for, because she had braced for the worst. She had spent 3 years bracing for the worst. It was the only posture she knew anymore. She moved through those first days the way a person moves through a house they expect to catch fire, light on her feet, always watching the exits, flinching at sudden movements. And Josiah Holt did not give her one single thing to flinch at. He kept to his word so exactly it unnerved her. He never crossed into her room. He knocked on the frame of a doorway before he spoke to her, even in his own house. When he handed her something, he set it down and stepped back rather than place it in her hand. The first morning, she dropped a cup and it shattered. She froze, hands up, bracing. He just got the broom. "Slick floor by the stove," he said. "My fault. Should have warned you." And he swept up the pieces, and that was the end of it. She stood there with her hand still half raised, waiting for a blow that did not come. And something in her, some held breath she'd been holding since she was 17, let go just a little. They fell into a rhythm. He rose before dawn to break the ice on the troughs and feed the stock. She learned to keep the fire and the bread. By the second week, she was helping in the barn, her city hands going rough and capable. He showed her how to milk the cow, how to gather eggs without spooking the hens, how to read the sky for the next storm. He was a patient teacher, few words, no mockery when she failed, just again, quiet until she got it. The talking came slow, in pieces. By the fire at night, mostly when the dark made honesty easier. She learned he read everything he could get hauled up the mountain, that the books on the shelf were his and hers both, that he taught himself Latin from a borrowed grammar one winter just to see if he could and could now stumble through Virgil if you gave him an hour and didn't laugh. He learned she could quote her father's Greek, that she'd been a teacher of children before, that she had a singing voice which he discovered the way you discover a wild thing, by accident, by staying very still. She was in the kitchen one evening not thinking, and she began to hum, then to sing. An old hymn her mother used to sing over the wash. She didn't know he'd come in until the song was half done. She stopped, heat rushing up her neck. "Don't stop on my account," he said from the doorway. "I didn't hear you." "I know. That's why I stood still." He looked at her with that tired face, and something in it had eased that she hadn't seen ease before. "Rebecca used to sing. 8 years this house has been quiet. I'd forgotten what it does to a room. A woman singing in it." It was the first time he'd said the name out loud to her. Rebecca, not my wife. The name itself. And Addie understood it had cost him something to say it. "Tell me about her," she said gently, "if you can." He was quiet a long moment. Then he came and sat at the table and he told her. Rebecca had come west with her family when she was 18. Her father had run the store in Hollow Pine. She was small, dark-haired, quick to laugh. She had a gift for making plain things beautiful. The quilt on Addie's bed, the carved cross by the window, half the small graces in the cabin. Rebecca's hands had made them all. She loved this mountain, Josiah said. Said it was the closest thing to heaven she'd see on this side of the dirt. She was stubborn as a mule and twice as proud, and she made me laugh, which no one had done before or since. His voice roughened. "We had 7 years. Then one winter morning she went out for wood. Snow 4 feet deep in places. I told her no. I told her to wait. I'd go myself when I finished in the barn. And she just smiled at me. Said she wasn't made of glass, Josiah. And she went." He stopped. "I found her 100 yards from the door," he said, "face down in the snow. I thought she'd slipped. Hit her head. I carried her in. She was still warm. I prayed she was just stunned. I prayed harder than I've ever prayed in my life." His hands had gone white around each other. "She was gone before I got her to the fire." Addie's throat ached. "Josiah, that's not your fault. You can't carry." "Can't I?" He looked up, and the grief in his eyes was 8 years deep. "I was her husband. She died 100 yards from me, alone in the cold, while I was warm in a barn with the horses. You tell me whose fault that is, if not the man who let her walk out that door." There was nothing to say to that, so Addie did the only thing she could. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. He went very still, looked at her small hand on his rough one, and for a moment she thought he would pull away. He didn't. "You're the first person to touch this house's grief and not flinch from it," he said quietly. "Town flinches, stares, whispers. You just sat down in it, next to me." "I know what it is," Addie said, "to carry a thing alone. I've been doing it a long time." His eyes came up to hers, and the question he'd promised never to ask was right there, sitting in the firelight between them. This time she answered it without being asked. She told him, all of it. Calloway, the bruise shaped like fingers, the cage with no bars, the wedding set without her consent, the night she ran, the 5 miles through the dark to the convent door. He listened the way he did everything, whole, still, not interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet a long time, and when he spoke, his voice had gone hard in a way she hadn't heard before, not at her, for her. "This Calloway," he said, "he put his hands on you. Once, to leave a mark, as a warning. And he meant to marry you, against your will, to take what's yours." "Yes." Josiah nodded slowly, and she watched him file it away somewhere the way he'd filed away the shape of an oncoming storm. "He won't reach you here," he said. "I want you to hear me. Whatever else is true, whatever you decide come spring, that man does not set foot on this mountain while there's breath in me. You have my word, and you've seen by now what my word is worth." She had. That was the thing. She had. It was the first night Addie slept all the way through. No bracing. No one ear open for a footstep. She woke at dawn and lay still a moment, astonished, and could not at first place the strange feeling in her chest. It took her a while to recognize it. It was safety, the bad thing she found by accident, the way she'd found the singing, the way the worst things always come, sideways when you're reaching for something else. It was late January, a long white afternoon with Josiah out checking the trap line. Addie was restless. She'd cleaned the whole cabin twice, and her eye kept going the way it had since the first morning to the sewing basket in the corner of her room, the one thing nobody had touched in 8 years. She told herself she was only going to mend a tear in her sleeve. She opened the lid. Inside, just what you'd expect. Needles, thread in faded colors, scraps of cloth, a half-finished bit of embroidery, a cover for the cedar cross worked in blue and gold thread, vines and leaves, stopped part-way. The needle still threaded through the cloth where a woman had set it down, meaning to come back to it. Rebecca had been making it the day she died. Addie's eyes stung. She lifted the embroidery gently to set it aside, and underneath it the basket's bottom did not sit right. A false bottom. A thin board fitted snug with a notch for a fingernail. Addie's heart began to beat strangely before she even lifted it, as if her body knew before her mind did. Underneath lay a small leather book, a diary. She knew she should not read it. It was private. It was the most private thing a person owns. The inside of their own head set down in ink, never meant for any eye. She read it anyway. The early pages were full of light, a young wife's happiness, the mountain, the man, little jokes only she would understand. Addie smiled through tears at a woman she'd never met coming alive in looping ink. Then the light began to change. An entry undated partway through. "Eli came again today. I told him to go. He doesn't understand I've made my choice. Josiah doesn't know he comes when the men are off the mountain. I don't tell him. I'm afraid of what Josiah would do." Addie went cold. Eli. The pale-eyed man from the coach, Eli Marsh, who'd looked at her like a horse he didn't mean to pay for. She turned the page with a hand that had begun to shake. Another entry, weeks later by the look of the ink. "Eli took hold of my arm today, said I was wasting myself on a man who'd put me in the ground with work before I was 30, said he could give me an easy life. I pulled away. There will be a mark. I'll wear my gray dress till it fades. I'm frightened of him now. I don't know how to say so without starting a war." And then the last entry, the hand unsteady. The date 1 day before the morning Josiah had described, the morning Rebecca walked out for wood and did not come back. "I saw Eli at the tree line this morning, watching the cabin. He didn't move. He just watched. His face was wrong. I have to tell Josiah. I've been a coward, and I have to tell him today, whatever it starts. Because if anything happens to me up here, it won't be the mountain that did it. It will be the entry ended there. Mid-sentence. It will be. The two words sat at the bottom of the page like a hand reaching up out of the snow. A woman who had known, who had been about to say a name, and had run out of time to finish the sentence because the thing she was warning about came for her the very next morning. Addie sat on the floor of the dead woman's room with the diary in her lap and could not breathe because it had not been the cold. It had not been a slip on the ice. It had not been a stubborn heart out in bad weather. Josiah had carried that lie for 8 years, reciting it every morning, like a prayer he couldn't believe. And he'd been right not to believe it. His wife had been murdered, 100 yards from the door, by a man who'd wanted her and been refused, and who had lived 5 miles down the mountain every one of the 8 years since walking free. She remembered something Josiah had let slip that first night almost without meaning to. He'd thought the marks on Rebecca's throat were from the fall, from a rock under the snow. He told himself that the way he told himself everything because the other thing was unbearable to look at. But the diary said it plain. A grip on the arm hard enough to leave a mark. A man whose face was wrong watching from the trees. The marks had never been from any rock. She thought of Eli Marsh on the coach, coming back up this way, looking at the new woman the widower was bringing home. The way he'd looked at her, the way she understood now he had once looked at Rebecca. She heard the door, Josiah stamping snow off his boots in the front room, calling her name easy the way he'd started to. Addie, kettle on. And she sat frozen on the floor with the proof in her hands, and a terrible question rose up in her like floodwater. Did she tell him? Because she'd seen his face when he spoke of Rebecca. She'd heard the grief 8 years deep. She'd heard him say, "You tell me whose fault that is." And she knew. She knew with a cold certainty that if she put this book in his hands, if she showed him the word hands and the unfinished, it will be then the man who'd promised Calloway would never leave this mountain alive, would saddle a horse within the hour and ride down to Eli Marsh's cabin, and there would be a second grave on this mountain before nightfall. And she could not let that happen, not because Eli Marsh deserved mercy. He deserved none. But because Josiah Holt had spent 8 years as a ghost, half dead with guilt, and she would not watch him trade the rest of his life for a moment's blood. She would not let the man who'd handed her a door, who'd handed her safety, who'd handed her a leather pouch, and the words, "It opens both ways," become a murderer to avenge a murder. There had to be another way, a way that gave Rebecca the truth back. That gave the law the man that did not cost Josiah his soul. She slid the diary back into its hiding place, closed the false bottom, laid the unfinished embroidery on top exactly as it had been, and she stood and smoothed her dress and went out to put the kettle on, and smiled at him, and her face did not shake 3 years of hiding her true feelings from a dangerous man finally good for something. "Long afternoon," she said. "Cold one." He shrugged out of his coat, looked at her a moment too long. "You all right? You're pale." "I'm always pale," she said lightly. "City living, you keep telling me." He almost smiled and let it go. And she hated the lie even as she told it because lies were the one thing they'd promised each other they wouldn't have. But some truths she was learning you had to hold a while, until you knew how to set them down without someone getting killed. She'd find the way. She didn't know it yet, but she'd find it. She had until spring. The reckoning came sooner than spring. It came 9 days later, and it did not come from the diary. It came riding up the trail on a lathered horse in a long city coat that did not belong on a mountain. Addie was at the window when she saw him, and her whole body knew before her mind caught up the old animal, knowing the knowing that had kept her alive for 3 years. Royston Pike. Calloway's man, the one who'd watched her in Boston, driven her, reported her, the hand at the end of Calloway's arm. He'd found her. She didn't think. She moved. out the door and into the yard before she could lose her nerve, because if he reached the cabin, if he saw the inside of her new life, she did not know what she'd do. "Miss Sterling." Pike reined up, smiled. He had a smile like a crack in ice. "You've led us a chase, all the way to the end of the world. Get off this land. Now. He swung down easy like he had all the time God made. "Mr. Calloway's been worried sick. His own ward vanished in the night. He's still your lawful guardian, you understand, till your birthday, which I make to be, what, 6 weeks off. I'm not going back. You're a minor in the eyes of the law, child. You don't get a vote." He took a step toward her. "Now you can climb on this horse like a lady. Or I can." "You can climb back on it yourself," said a voice behind Addie, low, flat. "And ride." Josiah. He'd come around from the barn without a sound for such a big man, and he stood now a little in front of her, not touching her, just between her and Pike. He had no rifle in his hands. He didn't need one. He was the rifle. Pike looked him up and down. The smile thinned. "This is no business of yours, friend." "She's my wife," Josiah said. "That makes it the only business I've got." The lie, the not yet true thing they'd been meaning to make true before the preacher, when the pass cleared. He said it without a flicker, and Addie felt it land in her chest, like something warm and frightening at once. Pike's eyes went between them, calculating. He was a watcher, not a fighter. She'd always known that about him. He carried Calloway's threats. He didn't make his own. "Married," Pike said slowly. "Well, Mr. Calloway will be very interested to hear that. Very interested. A marriage can be looked into, annulled, especially when the bride was taken across territory lines while still under guardianship." He backed toward his horse, the smile crawling back. "He'll come himself, you understand. For something like this, he doesn't lose things, Mr. Calloway." "Then he can come," Josiah said, "and he can learn what every man on this mountain already knows. Some things up here can't be taken. They're only ever given." Pike mounted, looked down at Addie one last time, that crack in ice smile. 6 weeks, Miss Sterling," he said. "Happy birthday in advance." And he rode down the mountain into the falling dark. They stood in the yard a long moment after he was gone, the cold settling, Addie's heart slamming. "He'll bring him," she said. "Calloway, he'll come." "Yes." "Josiah, I'm sorry. I brought this to your door. All of it. You took me in to be free of your tomb, and instead I've—" "Stop." He turned to her, and for the first time he reached out without setting it down and stepping back. He took her by the shoulders, gently, firmly, and he made her look at him. "You didn't bring trouble to my door. You brought a person. The trouble was already following her. That's not the same thing. You hear me?" She nodded, her eyes hot. 6 weeks, he said. "On your birthday, his claim dies. The law cuts him loose. We just have to hold the line till then." And holding a line. Through a hard winter, against a thing that wants to take what isn't his. The ghost of that old smile. "That I know how to do." And standing there in the snow with one storm just ridden down the mountain, and a worse one coming, and a dead woman's unfinished sentence burning a hole in the floor of the room behind her, Addie Sterling made herself a promise. 2 men were coming in their way to take things that did not belong to them. Calloway coming up the mountain for her, and the truth about Eli Marsh waiting down it 8 years buried. She would face them both. She would give Rebecca back her ending, and she would do it without letting the good man beside her lose himself to blood. She didn't know how yet, but she had stopped believing she was a thing that anyone got to take. And a woman who has stopped believing that is a far more dangerous person than the men hunting her have any idea. The pass cleared the first week of March, and so did the way down to a reckoning 8 years in coming. But the truth came first, because Addie made it come first. She had spent 6 weeks turning the problem over in the dark. How to give Rebecca her ending without giving Josiah a hangman's rope. And the answer, when it came in the shape of an old woman. Her name was Cora Demps. She kept a small place at the edge of Hollow Pine, a widow herself near 65, with hands knotted from work and a back that had stopped apologizing for being bent. The day the pass opened, Josiah took Addie down to lay in supplies, and while he loaded the wagon, Cora Demps took one look at the new bride and folded her into the warm dark of her kitchen like she'd been waiting all winter to do it. "So you're the girl up on the Holt place," Cora said, pouring coffee without asking. "Sit. You've got a face that's carrying something. I know the look. Wore it myself 40 years. And Addie, who had not had a woman to talk to in 3 years, who had buried her own mother at 15, sat down in that kitchen and felt something in her chest come loose. "You knew her," Addie said. "Rebecca." Cora's hands went still on the pot. "I knew her," she said softly. "Best girl this mountain ever grew. Why do you ask me that child with that face?" And Addie made a decision. She'd been alone with the diary for 6 weeks, and she was so tired of being alone with terrible things. She told Cora, not everything, but enough. The false bottom, the pale-eyed man at the tree line, the word hands, the sentence that stopped before the name. Cora Demps sat down slow, like her legs had gone out from under her, and when she looked up, her old eyes were wet and furious at once. "I knew it," she whispered. "God forgive me. I knew it 8 years and I never said, because I had nothing but a feeling and a coward's heart." Her hand found Addie's across the table and gripped it hard. Eli Marsh courted that girl before Josiah ever did. She told him no. And a man like that, a no doesn't end it. A no just moves it underground. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. He was the one found her, you know. Said he was. Came riding into town that morning saying he'd seen Holt's wife dead in the snow before Josiah had hardly carried her in. How'd he know, I always wondered. How'd he know so quick? And I said nothing. For 8 years, I said nothing. "You can say it now," Addie said. "We both can, but Cora, if we put this in Josiah's hands, he'll kill him, and then they'll hang Josiah, and Eli Marsh takes a second life from that house without lifting a finger." Cora looked at her a long moment, and something old and steel-hard came up in the old woman's face. "Then we don't put it in Josiah's hands," she said. "We put it in the laws. There's a circuit marshal due in Hollow Pine inside the month, and there's me. Who heard Eli Marsh say a thing in this very kitchen 3 winters back when he was deep in drink and grieving a woman everyone thought he had no cause to grieve?" She squeezed Addie's hand. "He said she'd be alive if she'd only said yes to me. I sat right here and I let it pass for grief. But that's not grief, child. That's confession. A man doesn't say a dead woman would be alive if she'd loved him, unless he knows exactly what her not loving him cost her." Addie's breath caught. A witness, an old woman with a memory like a steel trap, and a diary in a dead woman's hand, and a marshal coming. It was not blood. It was better than blood. It was the kind of justice that left the Avengers' hands clean. "We'd do it together," Cora said. "And we do it right, so it sticks. So that snake can't slither out of it." Her chin came up. "I've been a coward 8 years, Adeline. I am done being a coward. Rebecca was the nearest thing to a daughter I ever had. You let me help you give her back her name." The plan took shape over 2 trips down the mountain. Cora got word to the marshal. Addie copied out the diary's last pages in her own careful schoolteacher's hand, so the precious thing itself need never leave her keeping. And they waited for the circuit to bring the law to Hollow Pine. But the mountain has a way of refusing to wait. Because 8 days before the marshal was due, 2 storms arrived at once. The first came up the trail in a long city coat. Ambrose Calloway, come himself, just as Pike had promised, with Pike beside him and 2 hired men behind. 4 riders breaking the clearing's white quiet on a hard, bright morning. Addie saw them from the window, and her old animal fear rose up, and then, strangely, settled. Because she was 21 years old now. Her birthday had come and gone 3 days past quiet, with Josiah giving her a wooden comb he'd carved by firelight and not telling her till after that he'd been making it for weeks. 21. His claim was dead. The law had cut him loose. He just didn't know it yet, or didn't care. She went out to the porch. Josiah came to stand beside her, and this time she did not tell him to stay back. This time they stood together. Calloway dismounted. He looked absurd in the snow, all polished Boston leather, surveying the cabin with a curled lip. Eleanor. He used the full name, the one her father had given her that this man had tried to make his own. Look at you, living like a creature in the wild. Get your things. We're going home. My name is Adeline, she said, and I am home. You are my ward. I'm 21. She watched it land, watched the certainty in his face crack just slightly. 3 days passed. Check your own calendar, Mr. Calloway. Whatever I was to you yesterday, I'm nothing to you today. Your guardianship is dead. You have no claim on me, none, in any court in this country. Calloway's jaw worked. He hadn't expected her to know the date of her own freedom. There are debts, he said. The old weapon, your father's debts. They don't die with your majority. They transfer. You'll repay every cent, or I'll see you in. There are no debts. A new voice. From the trail. And up rode a man Addie had never seen, gray and spare and official, with a star on his coat, and 3 hollow pine men behind him. And beside him, jouncing on a mule, with her chin set like a fence post, rode Cora Demps. The marshal had come 8 days early. Marshal Foss, the gray man said, swinging down. And I've spent a long morning with Mrs. Demps here, and a longer one with the territorial records she put me onto. He looked at Calloway with the flat patience of a man who has met 100 Calloways. Funny thing about a man who makes a trade of being guardian to orphan girls. You start pulling the thread, it doesn't stop. 3 wards before this one, Mr. Calloway. All of them girls who came into money. All of them signed it over to you. And 2 of them, sir, dead inside a year of doing it. His voice never rose. That was the terrible thing. Boston's got questions for you that'll take more than a winter to answer. Questions a man doesn't ride away from. The color went out of Calloway's face. The polished man came apart at the seams right there in the snow the moment the thing he was sure of stopped being sure. This is slander. This is a territorial marshal, Foss said, telling you to put your hands where I can see them. You came up this mountain to collect somebody. Instead, you're the one going back down in irons. Pike was already backing his horse, already deciding his loyalty had a price, and Calloway had just stopped being able to pay it. The hired men looked at 4 armed mountain men and a marshal and made the only arithmetic that made sense. Nobody drew. Nobody died. Calloway was led down the mountain with his wrists bound and his fine coat dragging in the snow. He did not look back. And Addie stood on the porch and watched the cage that had owned her for 3 years ride away in pieces. She did not feel triumph. She felt a strange, light, empty feeling of a weight set down after you've carried it so long your body forgot it wasn't part of you. Josiah's hand found hers. You, all right. I will be, she said, and meant it. But there was a second storm, and it had a name carved above a doorway. The marshal was making to leave when Addie stopped him, Cora at her shoulder, and she put into Marshal Foss's hands the pages she'd copied in her school teacher's hand. And she told him with Cora, filling in what Cora knew the whole of it. Eli Marsh, the tree line, the hands, the unfinished sentence, the thing Cora had heard in her own kitchen 3 winters back. Josiah stood listening, and Addie watched the truth go into him like a blade going in slow. She watched 8 years rearrange themselves behind his eyes, the slip on the ice that was not a slip, the cold that was not the cold, the morning he'd carried his warm wife in from the snow and blamed himself for letting her walk out a door, all of it turning in the space of a minute from a tragedy he'd caused into a crime done to her by a man who'd lived 5 miles away ever since. His hands closed into fists. His whole body went toward the barn, toward a horse, toward the 5 miles down the mountain where Eli Marsh was sitting in a cabin, not knowing the past had finally come for him. Josiah. Addie stepped in front of him, put both hands flat on his chest, felt his heart going like a hammer. Josiah, look at me. He killed her. His voice was not his voice. He killed her, and he found her, and he told the town, and he watched me bury her, and he let me carry it. 8 years he let me carry it, Addie. I know. Get out of my way. No, she did not move. A girl of 21 hands flat on the chest of a man twice her size and 3 times her grief, and she did not move 1 inch. I'll not move, because I know exactly where that horse takes you. It takes you to his door, and it takes you to his throat, and then it takes you to a rope. And I did not cross 2,000 miles and a frozen mountain to watch the one good man I ever met hang for the likes of Eli Marsh. I won't. I won't do it. He doesn't deserve to live. Maybe not. And her voice cracked the still air. Maybe he doesn't. But you don't deserve to die for him. And Rebecca. She caught his face in her hands the way she had that first week, made him look at her. Rebecca doesn't deserve to have her name end in a second killing. You think she wants that? You think she wants to be the woman 2 men died over? Or do you think she wants the truth said out loud, in daylight, in front of the whole town that whispered about her for 8 years, by a marshal with a star on his coat, so that everyone who ever wondered knows that she did nothing wrong, that she was a good woman murdered by a small man, and that it was never ever your fault? He was shaking, the fists half open now. The law will hang him for you, Addie said gentler. Let it. Let the law have him. Keep your hands clean, Josiah. Keep your hands for the living. For me. Don't give that man one more thing from this house. Not your guilt, not your grief, and not your soul. For a long, terrible moment, she did not know which way it would break. Then Marshal Foss spoke quiet from behind her. Mr. Holt, I've got the diary, and I've got Mrs. Demp's, and I've got a confession 3 winters old said in front of a witness. That's enough to take a man and hang him legal. You ride down there now, you turn the strongest case I've seen in 10 years into a brawl, and you put a noose around your own neck. Let me do my job. I'll bring him in before nightfall. You have my word, and out here I'm told that still counts for something. And slowly, Josiah Holt's fist came open. He sat down hard on the porch step, this huge weathered man, and he put his face in his hands. And 8 years of grief and guilt and the unbearable wrongness of it all came out of him at last in great racking silent sobs that shook his whole frame. Addie sank down beside him and put her arms around as much of him as she could reach. And Cora Demps sat down on his other side, an old woman who'd loved Rebecca like a daughter, and the 3 of them held on to each other on the cold steps while the marshal rode down the mountain to do the thing that did not require any of their hands. They took Eli Marsh before dark. Cora said later he didn't even run. Said when the star came through his door, he just set down his cup and nodded like a man who'd been waiting 8 years for the sound of those particular boots. The guilt had been eating him the whole time, she said. It eats the quiet ones worst. He confessed it all before they'd even left his cabin. The diary, it turned out they hardly needed. He wanted it out of him, the way a wound wants the bullet out. He hanged in the spring by law, with his name in the record and Rebecca's name cleared in the same stroke. The town that had whispered about a strange woman who died odd in the snow learned at last that there had been nothing strange about her at all. Only a good woman and a small, wicked man, and a truth that took 8 years, and a girl from Boston to dig up out of a sewing basket. They buried that truth gently, the way you bury anything that's finally come to rest. And then they got on with the business of the living. Josiah took Addie up the hill under the aspens, to the simple stone that said Rebecca Holt. He cleared the last of the snow from it with his bare hands the way he must have 100 times. But it was different now. Addie could see it. The grief was still there. The grief would always be there, but the guilt had gone out of it. And without the guilt, the grief was just love with nowhere left to go, which is a sorrow a man can carry, which is a sorrow that doesn't kill you. "I spent 8 years thinking I let you die," he said to the stone. "Quiet. I'm sorry it took me so long to learn I didn't. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, but I know now that I didn't fail you either. And I think you'd want me to stop living up here like I went in the ground with you." He was quiet a moment. "I met somebody, Beck. She's stubborn as you were. She stood between me and the worst thing I ever almost did. I think you'd have liked her. I think you'd have ganged up on me together is what I think." Addie's eyes were streaming. She slipped her hand into his. "Thank you," she whispered, to the stone, to the woman she'd never met and somehow knew. "For the diary, for trusting it to whoever came after. You saved him too, you know. You reached up out of 8 years, and you saved him." The wind moved in the aspens, and if it carried an answer, it kept it to itself. But they both stood a while in the not unhappy quiet, and then they walked back down the hill together, toward the cabin, toward the smoke rising thin and straight from the chimney, toward the rest of it. They married proper that spring, in the little church in Hollow Pine with the pass open and the whole town turned out, the same town that had whispered, now packing the pews, to see the widower Holt smile for the first time in 8 years. But the part Addie kept, the part she'd take out and turn over in her mind for the rest of her life, came the night before, by the fire, when Josiah took both her hands and said the thing she'd never expected to hear from any man. "I want you to marry me," he said, "but I want you to hear me first. That pouch is still on the shelf. It's still got passage in it to anywhere you please. Marrying me doesn't change that. It never will. You wake up any morning of your life and decide this mountain's too cold or this man's too quiet, or you just want to see the ocean again. The door opens both ways. It always will. I'm not asking to keep you Addie. A man who loves a thing doesn't cage it. I learned the wrong half of that, watching a small man cage a woman, and I learned the right half watching you walk free up a mountain to get away from him." His voice went rough. "I am asking you to choose me, today. And tomorrow, and to keep choosing only as long as choosing me makes you glad. That's all. That's the whole of what I want." And Addie Sterling, who had been threatened and bargained over and watched and worn down, who had been a line in another man's ledger for 3 long years, looked at this man who was handing her along with his whole heart the key to the door. "I choose you," she said, "today, and I expect I'll keep choosing you a good long while. But I'll tell you a secret, Josiah Holt." She leaned in close. "A door you're free to walk out of is the only door worth staying behind. A year on the cabin was not a tomb. You could hear it before you saw it coming up the trail. A house with noise in it again. Cora Demps came up every Sunday on her mule and stayed for supper and told stories about Rebecca until Addie felt she'd known her, and told stories about Addie's own mother. She somehow dug up from a traveling preacher who'd known the Boston parish, so that Addie got pieces of her mother back, two-handed up the mountain by an old woman who decided her last work on this earth would be mending what fear had broken. The garden Rebecca planted came up that spring, tended now by other hands. The harmonica still came out some nights, but the tune had changed. It wasn't lonesome anymore. It was just music. And Addie stood in the doorway one gold evening under the beam, where another woman's name was carved, a name she'd come to honor rather than fear, and she watched her husband split wood in the last of the light, and she thought about everything that had brought her here, about the long dark walk to a convent door, about the leather pouch on the shelf that she had never once opened and never would, because a gift freely given doesn't need to be spent to be worth everything, about a dead woman's unfinished sentence finished at last in daylight in front of everyone, She had come up this mountain a frightened girl who believed her whole life would be decided by other people's hands. She had learned different. She had learned that the truth spoken plain, even when it's 8 years late, can give the dead their rest and the living their lives back, both in the same breath. She had learned that kindness given without a hook is the rarest and realest thing there is. And she had learned from a tired man on a frozen mountain that the people who love you best are the ones who leave the door open and trust you to stay. The wind came down off the high peaks cold and clean, and in the warm cabin behind her, the fire burned steady against the coming dark. For the woman who'd found it, for the man who'd opened it, for an old friend who came every Sunday, and for the memory of the one who'd lit the way out of the snow 8 years and a whole life ago and asked nothing in return but to finally at last be known.